The psalm as a whole. Judge me, O Lord, for I have walked in my integrity, and I've trusted in the Lord without wavering. Test me, O Lord, and try me. Refine my kidneys. Come to that, would say something like mind, and my heart. For your steadfast love is before my eyes, and I walk about in your faithfulness. I do not sit with idolaters, nor do I consort with deceitful, dissembling people. I hate the company of evildoers, and will not sit with the wicked. I hereby wash my hands in innocence, so that I may go around your altar, O Lord, singing a song of thanksgiving and telling all your wonderful deeds. O Lord, I love the house where you reside, the place where your glory dwells. Do not take away my soul, my life, with sinners, nor my life with murderers, in whose hands are depravity, whose right hands are full of bribes. But I will walk in my integrity. Redeem me and be gracious to me. My foot stands on level ground. In the great assembly, I will bless the Lord. Or bless you, O Lord. Now we come here to the last class of individual laments that we're going to look at. First of all, you have straightforward laments that petition for help. You're in trouble. Doesn't matter what the trouble is, you ask for help. And then there's a subclass of those petitionary psalms which have to do with complaining to God. And they're usually marked by the questioning, why, how long, when. Now those questionings. Then there are penitential psalms. We had a look at Psalm 51. And we also had a look at Psalm 25, which you did, penitential psalms. And now we have psalms of innocence. Psalms in which a person comes before God and claims to be innocent and pleads for God's justice, his judgment. Now you get three different kinds of confession in each one of these. The focus of confession in these two laments is confessions of faith in God. Penitential psalms have confessions of faith in God, but then as well as that you get a confession of sin, and now in these psalms you have confessions of innocence. These psalms of innocence have quite unnecessarily caused difficulty with Protestants and Lutherans. Equally, whether it is the Calvinist tradition or the Lutheran tradition, because how can anybody come before God and say, I am innocent? And yet, by doing so, we in fact show that we don't understand what the doctrine of justification is all about, which is that I can in fact stand before God and say, I'm righteous. That means I am innocent. However, that's an aside. Very important subclass of psalms. There's some debate about this psalm as to its genre. It's obviously an individual lament in character, but there's no description of trouble. There's no description of any trouble. So laments usually say something is wrong. Here, there's no description of trouble. It's merely, we merely assume that this person is somehow facing false accusations. In place of a description of trouble, you get a confession of innocence. Right? So it's not your typical lament. The second feature of this is the prayer for purification. Who is the person speaking here? Now, there's there's a wide range of opinion, but basically there are two fundamental points of view. Number one, the person who's speaking here is either a priest or a Levite, And this psalm is prayed before they log in for service, either at the beginning of their roster, now they're rostered week on, week off, or before the service for a particular day. So it's a prayer for purification at the beginning of service at the temple, and it could either be a priest, or if you're going to focus on the song of thanksgiving going around the altar, it could be a Levite and one of the Levitical musicians. So it's a song of purification for a priest before service or a musician before service. There's a whole number of things here that point to this. First of all, there's the going around the altar. There's only one occasion in which lay people actually go around the altar, and that's in the Feast of Tabernacles. Normally, it's only priests or Levites that have some access to that most holy place, the altar of burnt offering. Secondly, the washing of hands and feet. If you go to the legislation in Exodus, before a priest entered the holy place or went onto the altar, he had to wash his hands because he was going to handle holy things, and his feet because he was going to stand on holy ground. Okay, so there's that ritual purification fits. The song of thanksgiving is not sung by all the priests, but only by the choir. So that points in the direction of a musician. However, there's other pointers here which make this more general. Either that it's the king, it's ascribed le Dawith, belonging to David, or the king representing the whole nation. Now, the second basic point of view is that may have originally been, if you like, a priest prayer, but then it becomes a prayer that's prayed by a pilgrim, person who comes to the temple on pilgrimage on one of the great festivals, probably the Feast of Tabernacles, where people actually go around the altar. So it's a prayer for purification. There is some connection in verses 4 to 6 where the psalmist dissociates himself from evildoers with the entrance liturgies that you'll find in Psalm 15 and Psalm 24. Entrance liturgy is before people come in procession into the holy place, they put themselves under scrutiny. The priests, they ask the question, who may stand on the hill of the Lord? And then the priest gives basically goes through the 10 Commandments, and the people say, I haven't broken them, okay, you can come in. Right? Entrance liturgy, a bit like our confession and absolution, the scrutiny before the absolution. So there's something of that. And there's also the imagery here of a journey, walking, gathering around the altar, and standing on a level place, standing on holy ground. It works in either of the two ways. Now, there's literary features here. There's a number of interesting features. First of all, there's the inclusio, the bracketing. I walk in integrity, I walk in my integrity, beginning and end. Okay, bracketing the whole psalm. Then you get in petitions. First of all, you get the imperative petitions in 1 and 2, and then 4 petitions there, and 2 in verse 11, and the negative jussive, don't do this, in verses 9 and 10. So there's a kind of bracketing there. Verses 4 and 5 are arranged in a chiasm with the use of the word sit. The people who you sit with, live with. Now, what strikes straight away as you hear the psalm is all the first common singular suffixes. Me, I. 24 of them. No, 20 times. You get that first person suffix used. And there's 6 masculine singular suffixes for God, you. So I and you. There's an interaction between myself and you, God. Lastly, And I'd like to call your attention to this. This is far more common than people note. Frequently in the ancient world, but also in the Old Testament, and particularly in the Psalms, people have body inventories. Now, various parts of your body symbolize certain things. So you get inventories, which is a list of various parts of the body. Now, notice the sequence here. The first part of the body that's mentioned are the kidneys, the most secret, hidden part of your body back here. Then you get the heart, then you get the eyes, and then you get the hands, and lastly you get the foot. Can you see the movement is from inside to outside? But representatively, with these 5 parts, you cover the whole body, the whole person, starting from the inside out. And secondly, the movement is then from thought to action. The inner to the outer, from thinking and feeling and desiring to what you do, the way you live. Movement from in or out. Now, that's very significant given the content of the psalm, which has to do with purification. Purification is from the inside outwards, not the other way around, from the outside inwards. The psalm has a loose chiastic pattern. I say loose because you get a bit of bracketing and there's some overlapping. It's not obviously so. Verses 1 to 3 begin with a petition for judgment by God with an insertion of integrity. Not of innocence, but integrity. Very important word. This is followed by a petition for purification with a confession of dependence on God's loving kindness and his mercy. Once again, going back to Exodus chapter 34. And then, in a strange twist, the psalmist dissociates himself, herself, from the wicked. There's a deliberate act of separation from idolaters and the renunciation of any association with the wicked. Who are the wicked? The ones who aren't Sadiq, the ones whom God condemns in his court of law. And then verse 6 to 8, you get the performance of purification, which leads in a very strange direction. First of all, there's the washing of hands for admission to the sanctuary in order to perform the song of thanksgiving in the holy place. And then as part of that purification, there's a declaration of love. Not love for the Lord, but love for the Lord's house. This is unique in the Old Testament. Love for the house of the Lord. What does it have to do with purity, purification, integrity? Very odd, strange, unexpected. Most unusual. And then, in contrast to the dissociation from the wicked, you get the plea for deliverance from death with the wicked, the sinners. Rescue from the fate of sinners, the people who've got blood on their hands, and rescue then too from the fate of people who are involved in depravity and in bribery. Notice the reference there to bribery. Probably bribery of judges, not just favours, but bribing judges in order to get a false verdict. And then you get the petition for redemption. First of all, there's the promise of integrity of conduct. Just as I have always lived with integrity, walked with integrity in my journey through life, so I promise to continue to walk with integrity. Now, integrity is much more closely to do with a good conscience. You know, that would be the closest that we would have. The plea for redemption, and then there's the vow to bless the Lord. Okay, let's take this through. section by section. First of all, the first 3 verses. Please excuse my croakery. Judge me, O Lord. Now, have I got... Judge me, O Lord, for I have walked in my integrity, and I've trusted in the Lord without wavering. Test me, O Lord, and try me. Refine my kidneys and my heart, for your steadfast love or your loving kindness is before my eyes, and I walk about, or I walk in and out in your faithfulness. The psalm begins with a petition for judgment and purification, but the focus is on God's purifying judgment. God judges a person in order to purify them. He deals with any evil in them, either the evil they've done or the evil that they've suffered. There's the petition for judgment, God's vindication, God's recognition that this person is pleasing in his eyes, that this person is doing his will. Now let's just focus there. What is it that God wants of his people more than anything else?
For them to do his will.
And what's his will for them?
Live in a relationship.
That's good modern waffle. Notice there's no reference to love here. No, that's secondary. The bottom line is something comes before any love. That comes as a result of it. What is God's will? Look, you should know, it's no difference Old Testament or New Testament. You better know this, because how are you going to pastor people and they come to you and say, what does God want of me? What? To depend on him. What's the word that's used in the New Testament? To have faith, trust. What God wants of his people is that they trust in him without wavering. Everything else comes after that. And you can see how this works out then in this psalm. You have here, in a way that, once again, we don't see it because we live in a different culture. Anybody hearing the first part of this psalm who knew anything about pagan rituals, pagan worship, would immediately have the following picture. Now, if I was a pagan person, say in Babylon or practically anywhere in the ancient world, I would bring an animal to a priest. The priest would slaughter the animal, and the most important part of it wasn't the slaughtering of the animal in order to burn it on the altar, but the priest then would open the animal up and inspect the animal. And there were 2 parts of the animal that were most significant, and they were the liver and the kidneys. So I'd bring the animal, it would be offered to the deity, whatever it was, and after that then the priest would take out the liver and he would look at the liver. Why would he look at the liver? Why would he inspect the liver?
To see the good fortune or like an augur?
It's righto. This has to do with augury, a kind of fortune telling, because from the liver and from the kidneys, people in the ancient world believed that the gods showed their will. How does the God feel towards me? Have a look at the liver, the kidneys. What does the God want of me? Have a look at the kidneys. What's my fortune? What's my good luck? Is it good luck, bad luck? It's all there, written, not in the stars. That's one form of augury. There's lots of different forms of augury, but the commonest form of augury was looking at the liver, looking at the kidneys. This is so much so that the commonest texts that archaeologists have found in the ancient world are either liver-shaped clay tablets or kidney-shaped clay tablets, in which you get which were augury tablets, which taught the priests how to read the liver, how to read the kidneys. Now, if one of you have grown up on a farm, you know that the liver of every animal is different, totally different, has different character, colouring, different aspects. Likewise, the kidneys are totally different. Right? So you get augury. You kill an animal in order to discover the will of the God. Now, this is turned around. The psalmist says, open me up before your eyes in order to do what? Not for me to discover your will, but for you to see whether I have done your will. Not for me to see your will, what you want of me, that's revealed. But to see to what extent my life is in sync with what you want from me. Do you get the basic picture? It's very hard for me to explain because we're not familiar with this practice of divination. It's a whole complex science of divination in the ancient world. You find remnants of it in the occult still to the present day, various forms of divination. The Roman Empire was built around divination, and there's still certain cultures like the terrible butcher generals in Burma that basically are guided by divination. It's very, very common still everywhere in India and in very many of the Buddhist countries, the practice of divination to discover the future, discover the will of God. Now, notice the contrast here with the pagan practice of divination. Now, the reason why the psalmist is quite confident on the outcome of God's judgment is that he has done what God desires him. What is that God desires of him? Judge me for what? I have walked in integrity. What have I done without wavering? I've trusted in the Lord without wavering. What's been before his eyes? Not his own goodness, but Yahweh's loving kindness, Yahweh's faithfulness. So his integrity, his good conscience is evidence of his unwavering trust in the Lord. If you like to put it in terms that we understand, his integrity doesn't mean that he's never done anything wrong, but that he has a clear conscience before God and that God is pleased with him. Now, he asks that God refines his kidneys and his heart. Now, kidneys, most modern translation don't translate kidneys because it's inexplicable for modern people. Once again, you've got to see it in ancient terms. Your kidneys is the most hidden, secret part of you. It is, if you want to use modern terms, your unconscious or subconscious mind, your hidden self. Your heart is not the seat of emotions, but your heart is the seat of the conscious mind, which includes emotions. So investigate, cleanse me, my unconscious self and my conscious self. The kidneys were believed to be not the seat of thought, that's the heart, you think with your heart, but you feel and you desire, and your passions come from your liver and your kidneys. By the way, do you know what the priests in the Old Testament had to do to the liver and the kidneys of the animal they slaughtered? No, under no circumstances. If they did, they would be put to death.
It'd be awful.
What?
Would they just discard?
They weren't discarded because then people would pick them up and do augury with them. They were burnt on the altar so that you couldn't do any of this augury stuff with them, which is the main part of pagan practice. Here, where am I? So we have here a picture of God as a metal worker and silversmith. There are three stages that are referred to here, three things that a metal worker a silver worker or goldsmith used to do in the ancient world. Number one, he would test metal. Let's say, for example, I took this ring or any little bit of gold to a metalworker in the ancient world and said, okay, would you like to have it? Do you want to buy it? He wouldn't just weigh it, but he would test it. He would assay it. Now, what would testing it mean? He would examine the degree of purity, because gold and silver always has a large percentage of impurities. And what you'd have then is a touchstone. You'd pull the gold across it and it'll leave a trace, and the colour that was left on the touchstone would indicate the degree of purity or impurity. That was before modern chemical analysis. By the way, it's amazingly accurate, that. So first of all, the psalmist asked God to test him to see what is clean and unclean, what is pure and impure. Secondly, asked God to prove him. To prove means to say, is this 100% pure, or is it 90% pure, whatever it is, of the metal. And then the third thing he asks is that he be refined, which has to do with the removal of impurity. So the testing of the metal, the proving of the degree of purity, and then the refining of the metal to get rid of all impurities. Then comes the next section in which the psalmist dissociates himself from evildoers. It's a bit like in baptism and confirmation. Do you renounce the devil and all his works and ways? This is a similar function. I do not sit. I declare that I do not sit or live with idolaters, nor do I consort with deceitful people, dissemblers, pretenders. I hate the company of evildoers and will not sit with the wicked. Notice the verbs here. Sit means to live with, under the same roof. Consort means to visit a person, going in and out. And notice here the very strong word hate, which is contrasted with love later on. Hating evildoers. So the psalmist dissociates himself, and this is very interesting, not so much, first of all, from people who commit crimes, wicked people in that sense, but from people who commit the worst crime of all, which is the crime against the first commandment. So he dissociates himself from open and secret idolaters, those who pretend to be worshippers of the Lord, but in secret are involved in either open or secret idolatry, who are automatically excluded from God's presence, breaking the first commandment. And then more generally, the psalmist dissociates himself from the wicked, whom God condemns for evildoing. Because if a wicked person comes into God's presence at the temple, God will not vindicate them, but they will come under God's judgment until they've dealt with their wickedness. Next, the enactment of purification, the center of the psalm. Okay, now just before we have a look at this, you need to envisage the location of this. Always try and see what's said in the psalm as concretely as possible. This is a diagram which is taken from the proportions of the temple in the Mishnah. Okay, now, normally speaking, people come into the temple from this eastern gate. There's two gates. There's the outer gate, the Nicanor gate later on, and then this is the gate of righteousness, the Lord's gate. Only those who are righteous, ritually pure, can go from this space to this place. This is the place of ritual purity. This is holy ground. Now, if somebody who is unclean, wicked, unrighteous comes from here to here, what will happen?
They fall under judgment.
They fall into God's judgment because their impurity desecrates His holiness, and therefore they bring judgment on themselves in a negative sense. The light of God's holiness not only exposes the impurity, but eradicates the impurity. Very dangerous. So before somebody can come from here to here, they need to be cleansed. Now, the normal activity for cleansing, low degree of impurity, is washing. Now, if you're going to wash your hands, you wash your hands because when you touch what kind of things?
Unclean.
Okay, you wash your hands from unclean things because your hands have been involved in unclean things. All the sins against the second table, right across. You can have right across all the 10 Commandments involve your hands. So you wash your hands from impurity that have been handling unclean things in order to handle clean things, and more importantly than clean things, holy things. So you have the ritual washing. Now, priests, as I said before, they were allowed to enter the holy place or mount the altar, had to wash their hands and their feet. Why their feet?
Holy ground.
Not just holy ground. These two places are most holy. This is holy ground. This place, that place are most holy. And handling not just holy things, but most holy things.
It would go into the mikvah.
Mikvah is a ritual cleansing for a woman or a man who's been some bodily impurity, not just impurity of the hands, but for normal priestly service, you just wash your hands and your feet. If you don't go here and here, a Levite who didn't go here or here would merely wash their hands. So you have washing before you come in here, and then you get the altar is this area here. Now notice the reference to those places here. I hereby wash my hands in innocence so that I may go around your altar, O Lord, singing a song of thanksgiving and telling all your wonderful deeds. O Lord, I love the house where you reside, the place where your glory dwells. Therefore, I'm not going to desecrate it. I'm not going to make it unclean, defile it. I'm going to maintain your honor, not bring shame on you. As I said, there's only one, normally speaking, the Levitical choir stands in front of the altar, and so you could say they go about in front of the altar, but the people only went in procession around the altar during the Feast of Tabernacles. The first day, you had all the people in procession coming in here, going once around the altar with palm branches, hitting the corners of the altar. On the 7th day of Feast of Tabernacles, and this was a real mess, because you can imagine that they went 7 times around the altar, the way Mohammedans go in procession around the Kaaba in Mecca, in procession around the Holy Stone. Now, that's the picture that you need to have in mind in this section of the Psalm. These verses speak about going up to and around the altar. There are 2 performative utterances in which something is not just said, but is done by being said. Okay? The first one is the act of purification. I hereby wash my hands in innocence. Has a double sense, that I am innocent and I wash it in order to be innocent. So it's the ritual washing of the hands that's engaged. And then there's the declaration of love, not as I would expect for the Lord, but for the Lord's house. Love for the Lord's house, which is connected with serving God with clean hands. The act of purification involved the washing of hands. in order to approach the most holy altar safely in a state of ritual purity, to bring the offerings and to receive the holy meat, holy food to be eaten from the offerings. I've given you the reference there to the washing of the hands and the feet by the priests. Now, this person who's speaking in the Psalms is purified in order to participate in the thanksgiving. One of two references there. Either, so this is a choir member in order to join the choir in singing the song of thanksgiving as part of the daily service, or it's the pilgrims who come in festival who then go in pilgrimage and join in the songs of thanksgiving and praise as they go in procession round the altar. And what they do then is recount the wonderful deeds of the Lord. And then you get, the thing that I already focused on that's of great significance is this very strange declaration of love for the house of the Lord. Can I say again? God, I would expect a declaration of love for God. And you get a number of Psalms, including the next one we're going to look, 116, saying, I love you, Lord. Okay? Remember that God says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, all your life. Now, but here the focus is on the house of the Lord. Why the house of the Lord? Well, if you go elsewhere in the Psalms, there's one place on earth that God loves above all other places. Well, it's the city of Jerusalem and his holy hill, his holy house. God loves that place, not for his own sake, but why does he love that place?
Where he meets us.
Because that's where he meets the people and shares his love with them. It's, if you like, the bedroom of God, if I could use a very crude analogy. That's the place that God loves. And this psalmist therefore declares that he loves the house of the Lord. Now, the picture that's used for the Lord's house is that it's a safe place. Remember, it's a safe place. What's the danger always for people? Why is it that people don't want to go to church? Why is it that people stay away from God always instinctively? Well, if you've got a bad conscience, what do you know?
Stay away because
you stay away from sinner and you avoid trouble, because unclean person, holy God, bad news. Now, instead of this being a scary place, the Holy of Holies a scary place, it is a safe place. God's safe place where he provides safe access, safe contact with himself, not unsafe. The Holy of Holies is the dwelling place of God's glory. God's glory is his manifest, gracious presence. Very, very important term, Old Testament and New Testament. So the Shekinah, the place where God resides, the place where God gives access to himself in a visible form. There you can say, I met with the Lord, I saw the Lord. The temple is the place for revelation of God's glory in the divine service. Now, what happens every morning and evening is that God, who hides in the Holy of Holies, reveals his glory through the fire and the smoke from the altar in the morning and evening service. So you get a theophany, the revelation of God's glory. Now, what's the connection between the purifying of the hands, you can understand that, and the declaration of love? And some of you touched on it when I asked the first question, what is it that God wants from people? Okay, what is it that God wants from people? Number one, he wants their trust, their confidence in him with a good conscience. But that good conscience then leads to praise, access to God, and access to God's love, which brings about what in turn? Love of God, but why love of the house of the Lord? Why does the psalmist love the house of the Lord? Because that's the place where he receives God's love. He can access God's presence. One of the most wonderful Christian virtues, which is prized by Orthodox people more than any other, is love for the Lord's house. I find it very seldom the case these days that people love the Lord's house. People are critical of the church instead of saying love for the church, the place of God's glory. This is followed then by a series of petitions, negative and positive. No, that's not it. What happens when you have all these things? Yes, and thank you, Andrew. You've got better eyes than I have. Dissociation from evildoers. Now you get the prayer for deliverance. Do not take away my soul with sinners, nor my life with men of blood, in whose hands are depravity, whose right hands are full of bribes. You have a plea here for the deliverance by God from death with the sinners. Now, just think through it once again. If a wicked person comes into God's presence, what's going to happen to them? God's judgment. In our modern sense, the word's going to come on them. What's the penalty of them coming into the presence of a holy God? Is death. So the sentence of death lies on anybody who desecrates God's holiness in the most extreme way possible. You have three different groups of people that are touched on here. First of all, men of blood are people who have blood on their hands, guilty of capital crimes. However, that's also extended in the Old Testament to people who are guilty of injustice, who use the court system in order to take the lives of other people and diminish their lives. So people have blood on their hands. There's a lot of people who have blood on their hands with the assassination of Kevin Rudd. We use that terminology, blood on their hands. Okay, that's the picture here. Then there's two other groups. There's two different kinds of sinners. People who are guilty of depravity. The term sema usually refers to either murder or gross sexual immorality. And lastly, people who take bribes. What's so terrible about bribery?
It's abusing a position of authority.
Yep. In order to do what? Think in terms of Israel. Justice belongs to God. You bribe a judge so that God's justice is perverted. You're mocking God. You're perverting God's justice. So you are pay so that the guilty will be declared innocent and the innocent declared guilty. Terrible atrocity. Then finally, you get the plea for redemption with vows of integrity and blessing. Let's look at that quickly. But I will continue, you could say, to walk in my integrity. I've walked in integrity, and from now on, I will walk with integrity to the rest of my life. In other words, I will continue to trust in you, Lord. I will always have your loving kindness before me, and I will always walk in your faithfulness. I will trust in your promises, and I will walk faithfully with you, O Lord, through my journey through life. Redeem me from this and be gracious to me. My foot stands on level ground. In the great assembly, I will bless the Lord. You have a petition for redemption here with vows of integrity and blessing. So there's the commitment here to God, not just that I am a person of integrity up to now, but a promise of integrity in the future before God. There's appeal to God's grace. Why God's grace? For redemption from the threat of the death sentence. If somebody who's a sinner, somebody who is guilty before God comes into the presence of God, the sentence of death. So there's the plea for redemption of that. Thirdly, you get the commitment to stand on level ground. Now, this is a number of different references. To stand on level ground is obviously referring to the standing on the courtyard, which is paved in the temple in Jerusalem. You get the paved courtyard. It's level ground before God. There's no crooked ground in God's presence. There's only level ground. But if you think in terms of a journey through life, you have a number of different ways of walking. You can walk. What's the opposite of walking or standing with your feet on level ground? You're standing on uneven ground, rocky ground, slippery ground. So my journey through life will be what? Straight, level, trusting in God. Nothing crooked, nothing slippery about it. Yes, that kind of thing. Okay? So standing on level ground before God. And that's only before God can we then stand on level ground. Elsewhere, there's always uneven ground. There's always stones that will lead to stumbling. I'll deal with the last part of this beginning of next period. Could you please, for your homework, make sure that you read this handout on individual thanksgiving. I will assume that you've read it and therefore don't need to go through it.
Are you coming around today or?
I don't know. That depends on you.
Yeah, well, that'll be good.
Okay, what time then?
1:30.
I think that would only be for half an hour. I've got another appointment, I think, at 2 o'clock.
I've got to take a boarder to the airport and pick up Molly at 3, so...